Noswaith dda, a croeso cynnes. Apologies for that, I've got an echo. Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to our first School of Medicine, Science and Health public lecture of this series. My name is Sarah Hatch, and I am the Public Involvement and Engagement Manager at Cardiff School of Medicine. I am delighted to be joined this evening by my colleague, Professor Matthias Eberl, who is going to deliver an exciting talk on how outbreaks of disease have shaped how we fight infections today. The talk will be roughly around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A session. Please feel free to use the Q&A function and pop your questions in the Q&A as you think of them, and we'll come to them at the end of the talk. So Professor Eberl studied biology at the University of Gießen in Germany, where he completed his PhD in 1998 on the immune response to parasitic worms. He subsequently held postdoctoral positions at the University of York, returned to Gießen, and later worked at the University of Bern in Switzerland. In 2007, he moved to Cardiff, joining the School of Medicine, where he has been leading a productive research group in the Division of Infection and Immunity ever since. He was appointed professor in 2018 and since 2020 has served as one of the school's academic leads for public involvement and engagement. His research spans basic, translational and clinical aspects of acute bacterial infections, and he collaborates closely with immunologists, microbiologists, mathematicians, doctors and industry partners. Alongside his research and teaching of undergraduate and postgraduate students, he is very passionate about science communication and committed to engaging diverse public audiences. A warm welcome to you, Matthias, and everyone attending this lecture this evening. We are very much looking forward to your talk. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I hope my slides work now. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about some of the most devastating diseases in history. And sorry, there was just a message coming up. Sarah. Basically talk to you about some of the most devastating infections we have seen, and not only to scare people, but basically to give a reflection on what we learned about how to treat and how to manage different infections. So what I hope to achieve today is I would like to explain how diseases like the Black Death, cholera, but also COVID have caused massive disruption to our societies, but also they sparked really important breakthroughs and transformed science, medicine, and public health, and managed and taught us how to manage diseases better. So with respect to diagnosis, treatment, and prevention, and culminating in achieving, for example, the worldwide eradication of smallpox. I would like to look at what these pandemics really taught us about how we can protect our communities, and how also challenges nowadays like climate change, antimicrobial resistance, and the increasing vaccine hesitancy and science skepticism are basically putting this progress at risk. So a little bit about me. I've been working on different aspects of host pathogen relationships for the last 30 years, about how parasites and also bacteria fight the immune system, and how our immune system then at the same time tries to control infections and provide lifelong memory and protection. At the same time, alongside my research, I'm very passionate about communicating science and raising awareness about infection and understanding of infection hygiene. And so we came up with a Superbugs platform, which is an initiative to conduct in-person events and workshops. We have an educational online resource. We train students and early career researchers, and we collaborate with lots of people in the UK and also internationally. And it's a way, or basically, to have fun and engage people in science and provide some inspiration and motivation for people to engage with science. Some of you may know that we're conducting big in-person events. For example, a pop-up shop in the St. David Center this summer that attracted 5,000 people, where we talked about bacteria and how they cause disease, how we can protect ourselves against diseases, and this was a really rewarding experience. And because this was in the St. David Center in a previous fashion store, we had the opportunity to have access to everything that was in this retail unit, including the former changing rooms. And the idea we had in those changing rooms immediately was to set up a horror show and explain different diseases from the past and showcase basically how these diseases spread and what we learned about protecting ourselves against them. This was on the back of our educational website that we produced together with teachers for primary and secondary schools mainly, but also for any member of the public who wants to learn something about infection. And I just invite everyone who's listening now to go later to that website if they are interested in any aspects of infection, hygiene, and health and science in general. Part of this website includes a very popular timeline that we developed, where we showcase the kind of diseases that I also want to talk about today, and that featured in our horror show. So kind of using different ways, but delivering the same messages in a hopefully in a very engaging way. So I want to talk you. I want to guide you through some of those outbreaks, and the whole story starts essentially 2,500 years ago with the plague of Athens that happened during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, and there was an absolutely devastating outbreak of a disease that claimed up to 100,000 people in Athens and around Athens, which at that time was around a quarter of the whole population. And the reason why we know about this is there was a person called Thucydides who wrote about the Peloponnesian War, but who also then wrote about the outbreak of that disease at the same time. And what he observed was that people who recovered from the disease were actually perfectly protected, and they were the ones that then took care of the sick and the dying because they couldn't catch the disease again. And he realized that the way he wrote it, for the same man was never attacked twice, never at least fatally. And so essentially what he described 2,500 years ago is what we now call immunity. And this applies to diseases like measles, to many other infections, smallpox. Basically, in many cases, when you catch one of those infections, you have lifelong protection, and you cannot get some of those infections twice. And this is the concept that then underlies the development of protective vaccines, for example. The disease that caused the plague of Athens is actually not really known. It might have been bubonic plague, measles, smallpox. There are various hypotheses around that. The disease itself was not is not clear because Thucydides was not a medic. He was a historian and a general, and so he didn't provide the kind of information that we would have needed for that. But he coined the concept, not the word, but the concept of of lifelong protection and immunity. One of the most devastating diseases in history was clearly the Black Death, and probably most of you have heard about that. It's a topic that's taught in primary and secondary schools. This was an absolutely devastating outbreak in the 14th century that in Europe alone killed around 25 to 50 million people, and in some areas in Europe that amounts to approximately 50% of the whole population over the course of only 4 years. It started in 1346, and it arrived from Asia and came into Europe through trading routes. And it's known as the most devastating pandemic in human history. There are estimates that worldwide up to 200 million may have died during that pandemic. As I said, it arrived in Europe through trading routes from Asia and then spread rapidly around the Mediterranean and basically affected every country in Europe, and in a very devastating way. If you follow the arrows there in the Mediterranean, there's a city called Ragusa, which is now Dubrovnik. This is a place that was very early affected by the Black Death. And the reason why I mention is this was part of the Venetian Empire, so it was very important to trade with other countries and regions in the Mediterranean and abroad. And the Black Death arrived there in 1348, killed 2/3 of the whole population of the city. And as a means of protecting, people came up with the idea of establishing a system to quarantine people to prevent the further spread of the disease. And the reason why it's called quarantine is actually because it was part of the Venetian Empire, so they spoke a language similar to Italian, and quarantena means 40 days. The whole idea was that they quarantined everyone who came from a suspicious area, or what they called suspicious lands, mainly sailors and merchants, and at the beginning quarantined them on remote islands and just left them there. And later they constructed these buildings that are on the photo, on the picture, and with the idea that everyone who arrived newly in the city had to be there for 40 days to make sure that they wouldn't transmit any kind of disease. So this is the beginning of quarantining people from high-risk areas, and this goes through the whole of history then as a means to protecting communities from deadly diseases. The other concept that emerged with the Black Death is shown here. This is what is known as a plague doctor. And again, this is a very popular topic, for example, in schools, because this is the first time people develop the concept of protecting themselves against a deadly disease. So it looks very scary, but it actually makes perfectly sense. It's a way the doctors treating patients and being in contact with people who are dead or dying, protecting themselves against bodily fluids, protecting their eyes, their head, their hair, and everything, their whole body. And the beak of the mask they were wearing actually contained herbs and perfumes to protect them against the stench of people dying in the streets. And the other thing is they thought that bad smell actually caused the disease. So neutralizing that bad smell with aromatic herbs was thought to protect the medical professionals against the disease. And so this is basically the first example of what we now know as PPE and what people in the hospital would, for example, wear when caring for patients with very contagious diseases up to COVID during the pandemic. The other thing is, obviously, it's a very nice costume, so you can buy it on Amazon. So this is one of the exhibits we had in our horror show in the pop-up shop this summer, basically just to visualize the whole concept of how scary it was, but also in being highly effective in protecting the person against the Black Death. In London, there was an outbreak in 1665, which killed 20% of the population, also in other areas of Britain. And what people then imposed, like Charles II, the king, not only a quarantine of newly arriving ships, but they kind of started the whole concept of lockdowns. They suspended trade, they banned fairs, they tried to prevent people mixing with each other. They closed the Scottish border to make sure that people wouldn't interact with each other unnecessarily. And at the same time, they had a quarantine in place with everyone newly arriving in it. So everything together was a very effective way, or thought to be a very effective way, of protecting Londoners against the Black Death and trying to keep the disease under control as far as possible. So again, showing how an absolutely devastating outbreak of this disease, shaped these concepts of social distancing, lockdowns, quarantining, and observing how people actually um, interact with each other and might spread the disease. The second disease I want to talk about is cholera, which was mainly transmitted or is mainly transmitted via basically contaminated water and contaminated foods. There were 6 major pandemics of cholera during the 19th and early 20th century, and it's thought that they claimed together between 20 and 40 million people worldwide. And cholera is still around. It's still a disease that plays a very important role in many circumstances. And the reason why I mention it here is because cholera actually was the start of modern epidemiology, where you would trace people with infections and try to find out where they caught it, who they interacted with, and what can be done to try to contain this outbreak. This is a poster typically from the 19th century when there was an outbreak in London, basically just warning the population of drinking water directly without boiling it. So they already understood that boiling water would somehow protect them against any kind of disease that they would catch from protected water, contaminated water. The person who started the field of epidemiology was called John Snow, who was a physician, and for the local authorities in London, he started to trace outbreaks of cholera in London in 1854, and he created a map of all the cases of cholera patients that occurred during that time, and he realized very quickly that they all centered around a street called Broad Street, and they were centered around the water pump in Broad Street. And he could actually then identify that water pump as the source of cholera in the center of London. And he convinced the authorities to broke the water handle of the water pump, and the cholera outbreak stopped almost immediately. It was then discovered that basically the index case of the whole outbreak was a cholera-infected child called Francis Lewis, and their parents were believed to have washed some of the nappies or the clothes from that baby in a way that the sewage and the contaminated water leaked into the water pump, and then everyone taking water from there basically was at risk of catching cholera. And so this whole concept of tracing outbreaks and identifying people who contacts is the start of modern epidemiology, and that's basically done now for all disease outbreaks to understand where the disease comes from and how it can be contained. The water pump doesn't exist anymore. This is a replica that stands in the street. It's now called Broad Street, not Broad, in the middle of Soho, and there's even a pub called the John Snow. Just as a reminder of how important that discovery was. Importantly, cholera is still around. It doesn't play a major role in most westernized societies anymore, but it's a very important disease that appears immediately after natural disasters, in conflict zones, whenever there's a disruption of sanitation. It's one of the first diseases that appears everywhere. It's still quite widespread in Central Africa and some parts of Southeast Asia, but after a natural disaster like a volcano eruption, a hurricane, a conflict like the conflict in Gaza saw immediately spread of cholera there. Whenever sanitation breaks down, cholera is one of the first diseases that comes back. And it's also a reminder that the WHO, so the World Health Organization, estimates that more than 2 billion people in the world lack access to clean drinking water. This is something we try to show in our horror show in the pop-up shop, basically just to remind people that we are very lucky in the UK and in many other countries to have access to clean drinking water and taps with clean drinking water. The reality is that more than 2 billion people in the world don't have that, and that's why waterborne diseases are still a big problem in many parts of the world. Related to cholera is typhoid fever, which is again a disease which is transmitted via contaminated food and contaminated water. And the reason why I'm have it here in my presentation is because of this lady called Mary Mallon, who worked as a cook in New York and who spread a disease called typhoid. Typhoid is estimated to have caused up to 30 million deaths over the last 200 years. It's very similar to cholera, so it's a very severe diarrhea, many other symptoms, and with a considerable mortality. Mary Mallon was an Irish immigrant who worked as a cook in in New York, and she worked there over many years. And at the time, people became suspicious because everywhere she worked, people started to fall ill with typhoid. Up to the point where then in the newspaper they coined the phrase Typhoid Mary, and from then on she was called Typhoid Mary and depicted as a person basically poisoning people, and so she became this kind of evil person and got basically a very bad reputation because of spreading the disease in New York. She didn't have any symptoms, and this is the way we depicted her in our pop-up shop. So basically, by dressing up a mannequin, so just try to remind people of her role and what we learned from that. Because the important thing is that Mary Mallon did not show any symptoms. She was perfectly healthy, but she spread a deadly disease, and this concept became very, very important then. She worked in at least 8 different families over through a very short period of time, and every time she came to a new family, people there contracted typhoid fever. She was then identified as the most likely source of that, and she was isolated. But she later returned to work as a cook, mainly in hotels and spas and restaurants, and she caused some severe outbreaks there. Um, Probably as was kind of common at the time, she admitted that she almost never washed her hands because hand washing and hand hygiene was not a concept that was highly developed at the time. And this is probably the reason why she managed to spread the disease so rapidly, working as a cook in large families or then later in restaurants. It's estimated that she may have been responsible for hundreds of cases and various deaths. Um, some estimates put it to up to 50 deaths. And there was a big typhoid outbreak in New York, which probably was in part her responsibility. Because the authorities identified her as the very likely case, they quarantined her in total for 26 years on this very small island outside Manhattan in the East River called North Brother Island. And so it's a really sad story. She's spent the following 26 years there. She died in 1938 at the age of 69. She was never allowed to work as a cook anymore and have any kind of interactions with people. And so she was just isolated there. The important thing for history is she was basically the first known person, which is now called asymptomatic carrier. So someone who carries a deadly disease or any disease, but does not show any symptoms and does not feel ill. This is a concept which is quite widespread now, but that was completely unknown at the time. But it's now understood that the same is the case for diseases like polio, for tuberculosis. We've heard about COVID. There are many infectious diseases where people don't realize they are infected. They are perfectly healthy, but they can pass it on and spread it and infect other people without knowing it. Which brings us to smallpox. Um, One of the most terrible diseases in human history, probably the biggest killer. There are estimates that smallpox killed 500 million people throughout history, particularly in areas like North and South America, in Australia, where smallpox was brought over by European settlers. and there are estimates that up to 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas and in Australia was a result of smallpox infection. Also some other diseases like measles and chickenpox, but smallpox was definitely a massive killer. Very deadly disease characterized by large blisters in the skin, so like shown on this not very nice picture. And so a very characteristic phenomenon, which is very, very old because we can already see it from Egyptian mummies like Pharaoh Ramses V, most likely died of smallpox. So almost 3,500 years ago, because his skin shows lesions that are very, very typical of smallpox. So it's very likely that smallpox is a disease that has been around for a very, very long time. This is a graph from London between the 17th and up to the 19th century, and just illustrating um, the impact of smallpox on the population in a crowded place like London. And so, on average, around 10% of all deaths in London were probably the result of smallpox throughout the 18th century. So it had a very, very massive impact on public health, on the life expectancy of the people there, and on the way people interacted with each other. Smallpox was known in many parts of the world, and so there are many reports from places like China, from the Ottoman Empire, where they realized that not only smallpox was a very bad disease, but the people who survived it were actually protected against. So coming back to what I said at the beginning about the plague in Athens, smallpox was one of the diseases that was recognized as giving you immunity and you couldn't become ill a second time. And people started to exploit that and created ways to deliberately infect healthy people with smallpox material to protect them against the disease. That was a concept that was called variolation, where you took material from the blisters from infected people, and depending on the area where they did it, some people used little tubes and blew that material into the nose of healthy individuals, or they created little scratches in the skin and infected the skin through that. So basically deliberately infecting people with a small dose of smallpox in a relatively controlled way. Of course, that was not safe, and some people died from that. Some people got severely ill, but in many cases it actually worked and protected people against smallpox. This concept of variolation arrived in Europe then through this person, Lady Montagu, who was the wife of the ambassador in Istanbul, in Constantinople at the time, who heard about the concept of variolation there, and she wanted to investigate that further. And when she came back to the UK, she made some studies around that, and she thought this was something she wanted to use in Britain also to investigate and protect people against it. The interesting bit about that is she tried to approach that in a well, I don't know, in a slightly scientific way, and she did several studies around that. The first thing is she tried it out on her own children, interestingly. Then she convinced the authorities to let her try a practice with prisoners, and the prisoners were promised to be set free in case they survived. So she variolated 6 prisoners. It worked with all of them. She again tried it. She got access to several orphan children and tried to protect them. And ultimately, with those data in her bag, she convinced the Princess of Wales to protect their children. So throughout those studies, basically the whole concept of variolation as a safe way to protect against smallpox became more widespread in Britain. At the same time, in Boston, there was a very similar approach, um, starting with, interestingly, with an enslaved man from Africa, probably from Libya, who talked to his owner, Cotton Mather, about the concept of variolation from that was common practice in Africa at that time, or from the region where he called. He was called Onesimus. His real name is actually not known, but he talked about that, and he convinced Martha that this is a valid method to protect against smallpox. So in 1721, there was a big outbreak of smallpox in Boston, and together with the physician Sabdiel Boylston, they carried out a large vaccination trial in Boston where they treated at least 280 people, and they had the control group of the people who were not vaccinated, and they could show that the people who got the variolation actually were much better protected against smallpox than the ones who were untreated. So this is the first proper controlled trial to show that vaccine was effective in that, and it contributed to protecting part of the population in Boston at that time. This became more and more apparent that deliberately infecting people with small doses of smallpox was protective. At the same time, then, many people realized that actually there's a very similar disease in cows called cowpox, which is a disease which causes some mild illness in milkmaids, for example. And people realized that milkmaids don't catch smallpox, and also they can't be variolated, or when you try to scratch smallpox material into their skin, they didn't show the typical reaction. And so this concept got bigger and bigger that smallpox might be a way to protect people against cowpox might be a way to protect people against smallpox. And there were some very small attempts by people like Benjamin Jesty in Britain. There was a person called Peter Plett in Germany who tried this out. The person who really took this on then was Edward Jenner, who heard about these kind of ideas and tried to investigate that in more detail. And he's now known as basically the inventor of the smallpox vaccine, because he was the person who actually wrote about it and who conducted studies and published it. The ideas before that, they were not really in the public domain. So what Edward Jenner did is he isolated material from a milkmaid and inoculated the 8-year-old son of his gardener. And 6 weeks later, he tried to infect this boy, James Phipps, with deadly smallpox. It's not a very ethical experiment to do if you think about it from today's perspective, similar to what Lady Montagu did with prisoners and orphan children. Times were different. Edward Jenner tried to give James smallpox and he failed, so James didn't fall ill. Edward Jenner didn't stop there. He tried it at least 20 more times. So this was a small boy, and Edward Jenner tried to infect him at least 20 more times against a deadly disease. And each time James didn't show a reaction, and so he was what we would now call immune. He didn't develop smallpox. He was perfectly protected. Jenner wrote lots of publications about that, and one of the things he did is he coined the word vaccine because it was derived from the Latin word for cow, vacca, and that's how we now know about vaccines and vaccinations, basically going back to studies by Jenner and then the people who followed up from that. Based on the success of this and the better understanding on how to inoculate people with cowpox, and then people later learned how to isolate the active compound from that, there were big vaccination campaigns in many countries around the world. This is a picture from New York from the 19th century, where the authorities try to vaccinate as many people as possible against smallpox to try to contain it, especially around outbreaks of smallpox. This is a picture of smallpox vaccination in England from 1962. So at that time, it was still very common to vaccinate everyone around. And the success of this became immediately apparent. This is a graph showing in red the smallpox death rate in Sweden. This is the country where the best records are still available and going back to 1751. And you can see that before 1801, there were many waves of smallpox and quite a substantial death rate. In 1801, Sweden began to vaccinate people, and the smallpox death rate dropped almost immediately. And at the same time, the life expectancy of people in Sweden increased from around 30, between 30 and 40. And you see this increase of life expectancy in parallel. Sweden then took one step further, and in 1816, they made vaccination compulsory against smallpox. And so the little residual death rate that you see there in this graph almost dropped again, basically to almost nothing. There were some little peaks later on. The last one in 1871, that was the Franco-Prussian War in Europe that caused quite some disruption, and that caused smallpox outbreaks in many countries in Europe. But Sweden became the first country to completely eliminate smallpox in 1895, based on the success of the effectiveness of the vaccine itself and the vaccination campaign by the authorities. This then went, many other countries did something very similar, and this map shows when basically smallpox was eliminated in each country around the world. Most countries in Europe were smallpox free by at the time of around the First World War and in the 1920s. Northern America, 1940s, and then Africa, Southern America, and Southeast Asia. They still saw smallpox cases in the 1950s to 60s, but only sporadically. And the WHO spent a lot of effort in trying to isolate cases there and vaccinate communities there in a very targeted way. Up to the point then when this person, Ali Malin, essentially was the last person in the world to ever contract natural smallpox. He was a cook in Somalia in 1977. He survived it, and he's the last person known to have contracted natural smallpox. Since then, basically smallpox doesn't exist anymore as a result of all the measurements in place, most importantly, the vaccination campaign. There was one more person catching smallpox. This is a lady called Janet Parker, who worked as a photographer at the University of Birmingham. She contracted smallpox when working as there in the microbiology department in Birmingham, probably because smallpox somehow escaped from the smallpox lab that still existed at that time. It never became really clear how that happened, if it was through the ventilation or some other places, but it was clear that she somehow caught it there. The smallpox lab was closed immediately for safety measurements. The person running that lab actually sadly committed suicide because he felt guilty for everything. They even taking all the safety measurements and precautions, there was not an explanation how this happened. But this person is the last human in history to die from smallpox, and since 1978, the world is free of smallpox. And smallpox was the first human infectious disease to be ever eradicated. So it's completely gone. This is a magazine published by the World Health Organization in 1980 when they officially announced it, that smallpox is eradicated. It's important to remember that this worked very, very nicely and very effectively for smallpox, but smallpox is essentially the only disease ever to be eradicated. One disease that is very close to being eradicated is polio. So this is the last one I'm really going to mention now. Polio is a disease that was very widespread not so long ago. And it's one of the diseases where many cases are asymptomatic. So like typhoid Mary 100 years ago. 3 out of 4 cases are asymptomatic, but 1 in 200 develop irreversible paralytic polio because the virus infects your nerves and the cells that control your muscle movements. The typical thing then is, if it affects the muscles of your limbs, it causes paralysis and degeneration of your arms and your legs. And in old pictures, you see very often children like this. Sometimes you still see people in the streets, old people who caught polio sadly during their childhood. But it was a very, very terrible disease and untreatable and irreversible. And the most terrible bit of that is it didn't only affect your legs and other parts of your body. In 5 to 10% of people with paralytic polio, it affected the muscles that control your lungs or your ribs and the way you breathe. So basically, these people were not able to breathe anymore, and they depended on a machine that was called the iron lung. They had to stay in there, and with a mixture of higher pressure and lower pressure, it basically artificially inflated and deflated the lungs and allowed these people to breathe. And this was a very common measurements, like in the 1950s and the 1960s, there were large outbreaks in the United States, in Denmark. And this is a picture from one of the hospital wards at the time, basically providing this life-saving treatment with the iron lungs to people with severe polio. And it's still used to some extent until very recently. This is a picture of Paul Alexander in Dallas, who died last year. He was the last man living in an iron lung until last year. He caught polio at the age of 6 and spent the following 70 years in this iron lung. There's still one lady in the United States alive who's probably now has beat his records, and she's the last person known to be in an iron lung. She has been there now for 73 years. So just a reminder of how horrible polio can be and how devastating. The important thing is, in the 50s, there were several polio vaccines developed, and they were introduced in England and Wales in 1956. And similar to what I've shown you for smallpox, the polio cases in England and Wales dropped almost immediately, and essentially polio is almost eradicated in most parts of the world. This is a similar picture of paralytic polio in basically everywhere around the world, and showing that a disease that was still very, very common in the 1980s is basically gone. And the only countries in the world that still have endemic polio cases, natural polio, are Afghanistan and Pakistan, and every other country is believed to be polio-free. So I just want to mention then, obviously I've mentioned smallpox and polio. The same is true for other diseases like measles, mumps, and rubella. We have effective vaccines that control many of them. The moment they were introduced, these very detrimental diseases kind of dropped very, very rapidly and established protection to most communities. And we have now very effective vaccines around that protect us against very, very devastating diseases, like including tetanus, rabies, diphtheria, and smallpox. And in smallpox, it was so efficient that smallpox is completely eradicated now. So just to come to an end, just to briefly summarize, what have we learned from this and from those outbreaks? I mentioned from the plague in Athens, basically for 2,500 years, we have had this concept of natural immunity already, and that people who contract some of these diseases like smallpox, measles, and some others, they are actually protected and they cannot catch the same disease twice. And this is something that we could then exploit for effective vaccines. We had diseases like the Black Death that led to very effective, basically personal protective equipment, PPEs, which is now used in hospitals and by healthcare professionals around the world. The idea of social distancing and quarantine came up. And at the same time, I didn't really mention that, but the plague obviously is spread through the fleas of rats. So pest control started to become really important because people realized then already that rats are important in spreading the disease. We had the importance of sanitation and hygiene in preventing diseases like that are spread through contaminated water, so like cholera and typhoid. The importance of diagnosis, the concept of people carrying diseases without falling ill themselves, but they can still spread it, and that why the importance then was of contact tracing to identify people those carriers were in contact with. That was very effective in smallpox because people then could vaccinate all the contacts of the original cases. We have vaccination to protect us against diseases like smallpox and polio, and so many of these diseases are a thing of the past, but only if we maintain things like vaccination levels, and if we manage to control and if we adhere to those measurements that were put into place to control them in the first place. So which brings me to COVID, when basically all of these things came together. We have experienced all of that ourselves. A reminder that COVID was essentially the deadliest pandemic in the last 100 years, with the exception of HIV. But HIV didn't create this sudden, very massive outbreak of diseases. It's more kind of bubbling along. HIV has caused up to 30 or 40 million deaths now, but it didn't have this kind of immediate peak like COVID. COVID has had at least 7 million confirmed deaths now. There are estimates that the actual real number is between 10 and 20 millions. And of course, then COVID overwhelmed hospitals. We all experienced social distancing measurements, the need to test ourselves with and without symptoms, because COVID can be spread through asymptomatic carriers. And so most of what I've shown you with these diseases from the past kind of influenced the way we actually treated and managed COVID, in terms of isolating ourselves, social distancing, the importance then of vaccination in controlling it, and having all these public health measurements in place to control the pandemic. The last slide is just a reminder that COVID is just one example, and we're constantly exposed to infections. This is a map of emerging infections over the last 20 years, and every little dot is either a completely new pathogen that was identified, or in red, a disease that spread to a new country, a new region. So a known pathogen, but that has spread. You see there's a lot of flu in there, some other diseases, but they are completely new viruses that appear all the time, similar to COVID. Some of them only infect a handful of people. Some others, like Ebola, Zika, or some others, they cause big outbreaks. And so we're constantly exposed to emerging and re-emerging infections. So just to emphasize how important all these measurements are, that we need to maintain research on treatments, on diagnostic tests, on vaccines. We need to develop public health measurements that are effective but not too disruptive on societies. And because we can never basically relax, there's always the next infection and the next outbreak around the corner, and we have to be ready for that. And so with that, I just would like to thank you for joining. If you're interested in some of those concepts, if you scan the QR code, it takes you directly to our Superbugs website, or you can send us an email with any kind of questions or feedback. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have now.
Thank you so much, Matthias. That was so interesting. And we've learnt so much from past pandemics and diseases that have really influenced how we deal with nasty infections today. Yeah, so anyone on the call, if you've got any questions, please can you put them in the Q&A, and we can work through those. Just a question from me, Matthias. So based on historical patterns, what do you think is the biggest lesson that we should carry forward to prepare for the next pandemic?
Be ready and be aware that it will come at some point, and that we basically we can never relax. There are diseases that we've managed to control to some effect, but people become complacent when they don't see polio or measles or some other diseases around, because we forget that they existed and we forget how bad they are. Measles causes many deaths and many complications. Polio is an absolutely horrible disease, but we forget about this because we don't really see it. And so we just have to remind ourselves constantly about history and how we managed to reach the level where we are right now. And basically just this preparedness of learning from history, asking for evidence, research, and learning from history of what was effective in controlling outbreaks.
Absolutely. Thank you. What do you think? Um, for you, you've described smallpox and various other really awful diseases. Which past outbreak do you feel had the most lasting influence on how we approach infection control today, and why?
Probably smallpox,
Yeah.
because it just informed. It was the first example where people really could show that vaccination works, it protects people. And then the logistics behind that were massive, because the WHO in the 50s, 60s, they made these big vaccination campaigns to identify smallpox patients, identify all their contacts, and they specifically vaccinated all the local communities around that. And so they managed to contain the outbreak, protect everyone around that, and in a very, very effective way, and in a way essentially that we have never achieved again. We were extremely close to eradicating polio, but um, we just didn't achieve that. And for various reasons, Pakistan and Afghanistan, it's still endemic because of, in part because of the conflicts there. Um, Everywhere else, it's basically eradicated. So it's possible. It would be
Mm.
possible to eradicate measles, but it's a very, very big effort. It's very costly and it takes a long time, but it's possible.
Thank you. So we've got a question here from Jennifer. Based on patterns, what do you think the next pandemic will be like? Also, given the success of vaccination in the past, why do you think we have difficulties with vaccine uptake currently?
Okay, difficulties with vaccine uptake is in part a lack of understanding of what vaccines do and how they work. Um, and the way it's phrased in media and social media, there's a lot of misinformation around. And at the same time, scientists are not always very good in explaining it. Vaccines carry a small risk of side effects, so there's there's no need to hide that. But the diseases they protect against are much worse. So there is um, there's this perception in large parts or in parts of the public that diseases like measles are something you deal with and you can manage and it's not bad. But we've just seen there was a child in Liverpool that died from measles. There were several cases in the United States that died. Measles can cause very severe meningitis and some other complications. It's not a nice disease. And the fact that many of us have had measles or 50 years ago is not a reason why we wouldn't want to take up vaccines now. It causes some very big problems, and people have forgotten those problems. Um, lot about vaccine uptake. A lot about uh, this is due to distorted information and misinformation. And I'm sorry to say, but this goes all the way up to the highest authorities in the United States now, because they're trying to claim again that vaccines are maybe linked to autism, which is absolutely untrue. It has been disproven many, many, many times in very, very large studies. There's absolutely no link between vaccines and autism, but this is now shown on the website of the American Center for Disease Control. They are the guys who essentially eradicated smallpox in collaboration with the WHO. This is one of the most important organizations in the world, and they re-emphasize this potential link between vaccines and autism, which is complete misinformation by the most important health authority we have. So it's, yeah,
Frustrating.
it's frustrating, really.
Thank you. A question here from Abby. Why is it that only around 7.1 million deaths from COVID are confirmed when it was estimated that there were between 10 to 20 million deaths?
I think this number comes from the 77 million confirmed COVID deaths. They are the people who had a positive COVID test. So most of them are people who died in hospitals and who had a positive COVID test. And many deaths in the community didn't have a test. In many countries, they didn't have the means to really test people. So there's probably a very there's a large number of people who are believed to have died from COVID without having a confirmed death. The 7 million is the official number from the WHO, people with a confirmed COVID test.
Thank you. So another question, just like how we learned things from the Black Death and smallpox about how to fight infectious diseases, do you think we have learned things from the COVID pandemic as well? And what are they?
Yeah, I'm just laughing because I think the previous question was also about what the next pandemic would be, and
Yeah,
we have
what it
learned a lot.
looks like.
We have learned a lot, and at the scientific level, we have learned a lot about how to collaborate, how to investigate an outbreak like COVID in extremely short time. We had the first batch of the COVID vaccine, I think, within 3 months of the first case. Like in April 2020, we had an idea of what the COVID vaccine would actually look like. The way people share data and reagents and investigate things was absolutely unprecedented, and the possibilities nowadays. So that's something we have learned. I think what we failed to some extent was to get a positive message around how people should behave to protect themselves and how science actually changes, because at the beginning we didn't understand what COVID was, how we could protect ourselves. There was some guidance of whether or not we should socially distance, whether or not we should disinfect the door handles in our buildings. And we found out more and more about that. It's now clear that COVID is an airborne disease. So disinfecting doorknobs is probably completely useless. Or disinfecting the shopping trolleys in the local Morrisons. Um, we learn about that, and we need to we need to explain to the public that scientific knowledge changes all the time. There's more, and whatever we thought at the beginning of COVID, some of those things actually turned out to be wrong. And if you then communicate that to media, they want a very clear answer. They want to know, does social distancing work? Should I disinfect my shopping trolley? Do face masks work or no? And they only accept yes and no answers. Science is an involving concept, and it's about probabilities. And when you ask a scientist, they will tell you, they don't give you a yes or no answer. They say, well, it depends. Or yes, there's a probability that this will happen. And it's not a very simple message then, but we have to try for people to understand that it's always more complicated. You cannot put it into a headline in a newspaper or in a simple tweet. It's more complicated, and people have to understand that there's no yes or no answer, and that science constantly evolves. The way we look at COVID nowadays is completely different to what we knew 4 or 5 years ago.
Thank you. I think we've just got time, a few more questions there. We've got time for one more. What impact or role will climate change play in the next pandemic, do you think?
Climate change plays several roles. One important thing we see already now is that diseases spread to new countries and to new regions. So some diseases that were only present in Africa, for example, are arriving in the south of Europe because the pathogens suddenly survive there, or they're transmitted by mosquitoes or other vectors that suddenly survive in more northern countries. So we see that diseases move to new regions, and this is a direct result of climate change, because then suddenly a mosquito species that transmits a disease in some parts in Africa can suddenly survive in Italy or in the south of Germany. And so we are starting to see this in and which is causing lots of problems. Um, and if you think about it, like malaria was endemic in southern Europe 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. Rome was built on hills because of malaria. And so we managed to get rid of malaria in the whole of Europe, but there's a chance that it may come back, and other diseases, virus diseases, are already coming back. We see in the United States diseases coming from Southern and Central America, like West Nile virus and some others, are becoming more and more important. And this is a direct result of climate change, basically.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We would be grateful if you would complete some feedback for us. This will be emailed out to all attendees that have attended this evening's lecture. Your feedback is so important to us, so we would be grateful for that. And just finally to say that our next lecture is going to be delivered by Professor Rhian Goodfellow on Thursday, the 12th of February. And Rhian will be talking about her life as a rheumatologist and medical educator. Deal. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much for joining today. Thank you very much.